Hopefully we'll
So
through in on one of these all.
yeah, too bad Andrew can't join us this time, but I think just good reason to sync up again and make a series out of it. So,
Yeah, and from reading all the stuff that you've been doing, um, you're clearly the person to be leading us through
oh,
three and I get maybe four too, right? I don't know. It's pretty complicated stuff.
it is. Yeah, I was reading your paper, not so eternal objects, which is yeah, provocative. You're good at that,
Yeah,
and
that's it's easy to be provocative and not very easy to back, back it up with enough evidence. But
well, we'll see. I think the lack of what consensus on the subject of eternal objects in Whitehead scholarship is evidence that yeah, that particular category in Whitehead scheme is problematic. So I think it's helpful for us to try to dig in and sort through it.
it's nice to be able to, yeah, talk about it because I don't know what your experience has been, but my experience, even back in school, was that there's really not that many people, right? Like, I think we brought that up last time to discuss these deeper issues with. It's typically very surface level process 101 type stuff.
Right. Yeah, to really dig into the nuts and bolts of the categorical scheme is not something you often find opportunity to do. Um, so I'm not sure exactly how to proceed, but I think yeah, I'm recording already, and
I've
I don't
got
know.
a question. I mean, I saw like I read through your recent your recent paper related to eternal objects. Great overview. I mean, you went over pretty much everything. And I was interested to learn from you what sort of maybe like nuggets you found in that more recent right material from the recently published.
The Harvard lecture notes stuff.
Yeah, that
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah. Um, well, there's one line in there actually that really struck me that George Shields also mentions about the way in which the realm of eternal objects is enriched by the passage of actual facts, um, which I mean, it's another way of Whitehead trying to get at the interplay between the primordial and consequent natures of God in some sense. But yeah, his actual wording here in the first volume of Harvard Lecture Notes, he says he hasn't yet coined the term eternal objects, even so he's speaking about the realm of ideas still. And he says, or his students record him saying that the realm of ideas itself alters in its reference to the particular occasions as they flow by. And so not only are these otherwise eternal objects or Platonic forms or whatever said to be altered as a result of ingressing into actual occasions, he goes on to say that the light of realization casts the shadow of truth back upon the realm of forms, thus enriching it. And in this way, each fact of realization takes its own place as an eternal truth, as an objective immortality, let's say. Um, and then he says that um, the eternal is now for us the total nature of the past, as the eternal is now for us, the total nature of the past belongs to it. So he hasn't even coined the phrase eternal objects yet. He hasn't worked out the consequent nature of God, but he's already beginning to think about how, in some way, the eternal or eternity is enriched and grows with the passage of the actual universe, right? And so that's, I mean, it's one of the most novel aspects of his philosophy. And I guess the problem is we're all still struggling to understand how that works.
Yeah, that's the real thing. Is like, sounds great. Another way of saying, like you said, what comes up later with the consequent nature. But what's my trouble has always been, I think, the same with many other people, which is I don't, one, it's obviously all very convoluted, but two, what is really gained here when he speaks in whether more poetic language or strictly philosophical sounding language? I don't see what, when the consequent nature, what's being added anyway, if the primordial nature is a complete envisagement or whatever of, like, what's your take on that? I don't, everyone seems to have a different view.
um, well, I think it's important to remember that Whitehead conceives of the realm of eternal objects as infinite.
Mm-hmm.
So, and this is, a question I have for you about what you're doing in your article, um, that, exploring the possibility that maybe the primordial nature only envisages some eternal objects, and asking, well, what finite set of such eternal objects would be necessary to sort of get the engine of cosmogenesis going? Um, because you want to be able to conceive of new universals arising in the course of time, right? Particularly what Whitehead would call the subjective species of
Mm-hmm.
eternal objects, right? So emotions and colors and all the qualitative universals. And Whitehead is quite explicit, as you note, that there are no new eternal objects.
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard other people like Terence Deacon, for example. I've had a conversation with him about the influence of Whitehead. He studied Whitehead early on in his career, he said, and then he ended up going more into Charles Saunders Peirce's work, because he told me he was concerned that Whitehead is sort of unduly limiting the set of possibilities that the universe can draw upon in its evolution. And that kind of confused me, because I always took Whitehead to be saying that there are infinitely many eternal objects. And so that means there is no limit.
Well, I
There
agree
doesn't.
with you there. I don't see how that would be a limit if it's, like you said, if it's infinite.
Right. So, I mean, maybe it would be helpful for you to, if you can, just briefly like lay out what you're trying to do in this paper, what you find inadequate about the normal way that Whitehead is interpreted in regards to the role of eternal objects, and what you're trying to do to provide an alternative.
I think it's mainly in line with how part five comes into play
Mhm.
with it. Specifically, like it's pages, what, 347 to 349 of Process and Reality, where you get into all of this God in the world, right? Talk, and what, it's just true to say that or whatever, right? The world's involved in creating God, is God creating the world, all of those points. I
Mhm.
know that when he gets to part five, he kind of just sort of more branches off into, it's not as like tight, right, as some of the other stuff, but still it's in there. And I don't really understand how part five can hold up if you don't allow for some sort of growth on the side of the eternal objects, I guess.
Mhm.
Aside from the many problems already listed of like how I don't, it's weird to me how something is unconscious yet, ordering things for relevance
Mhm.
and whatnot, and how, so I feel like maybe looking at the difference between like theoretical knowledge versus experiential knowledge, like how is nothing gained through that process of instantiating the stuff.
Mhm.
It's it's odd to me, and it puts God in a weird position as well to me, where it's like we are capable of doing things that now God is not, which is weird. because they're not like logical impossibility type things.
Right.
But yet apparently God can't have what, like propositional feelings or um
Well, the primordial nature can't, at least.
sure, but I guess then what is God as a whole? Well, then I don't, this bifurcation of it, I and how is it how is it brought together then, um
Mhm.
it's too obscure still.
He definitely lapses into mystical poetry in part five, but I am, I mean, I admit much remains obscure about the divine nature, which seems inevitable on some level. But, earlier, I mean, there's all this interesting work done on the like a compositional analysis of process and reality, and like when did like that Lewis Ford kind of inaugurated, and when in the course of writing it did Whitehead discover that he needed the consequent nature. And it seems, looking at the Harvard lecture notes, um, that he was already beginning to see the need for that in like 1924, 1925, so several years before he started writing Process and Reality. But then in Process and Reality itself, it does almost seem like the consequent nature is a bit of an afterthought. Um, but early on, like in the first chapter, there's this really kind of enigmatic and um, intriguing statement when he's talking about, it's the bottom of page 12, where he's talking about the truth. And he says the truth itself is nothing else than how the composite natures of the organic actualities of the world obtain adequate representation in the divine nature. Such representations compose the consequent nature of God, which evolves in its relationship to the evolving world without derogation to the eternal completion of its primordial conceptual nature. Um, and so
Well,
he says there can be no determinate truth correlating impartially the partial experiences of many actual entities apart from one actual entity to which it can be referred. Um, the reaction of the temporal world on the nature of God is considered subsequently in part five, where it is termed the consequent nature. And so very early in Process and Reality, I mean, he maybe went back and wrote this after what he does in part five, but it's clear that the consequent nature is essential for his understanding of truth, how true propositions are possible, um, and that's very interesting, right? Because on the one hand, while he doesn't allow novel eternal objects, he does allow novel propositions. I mean, that's sort of the engine driving the ingression of novelty into the universe. You quote that great line about propositions: "It's more important that they're interesting than that they're true."
mhm.
That, in the sense that they conform to the past or not. But what he's suggesting here is that as new propositions do become part of the universe, even if they're false when first prehended, they can become true for subsequent actual occasions, right? Because they've entered into the universe, and now the subsequent occasions conform to that. Um, but that you need this consequent nature of God that's constantly growing, um, and feeling all of these novel propositions for.
So is that kind of your take on it, that like somehow we have to distinguish them between the eternal objects and the propositions, and that the eternal objects somehow is some infinite set, but the propositions are, it's growing in relationship to the world.
Right, right. Yeah, so there are propositions in the consequent nature of God. Um, even if and that's why the primordial nature is unconscious, because it's just conceptual. There's no physical experience. Um, and on Whitehead's definition of consciousness, you need that contrast between physical and conceptual prehension. Um,
I think if he clearly stated stuff like that way very explicitly, that would be a lot more um I could certainly accept that a lot more.
Mm. Yeah.
But and perhaps that is, like you said, that's what he's, I realize that there's these quotes, maybe that's what he meant all along, but obviously a lot of people have been baffled by what exactly he's trying to do
Hmm.
there.
Hmm.
So in follow-up works, it would have been nice to clarify if that's really what he wanted, you know. um
Part of the trouble is he's really, which becomes even more obvious when you read the lecture notes, you see him in the act of working these ideas out, right? And so it's a process philosophy that is very much articulated as an open-ended process, you know. And he, if he could have gone back and rewritten Process and Reality after realizing everything that came to him in the course of writing it, it probably would have been a lot, a lot clearer. Um, I could say that for most of the stuff that I've ever written. Um,
Granted, he's going for the biggest scope
yeah,
possible. So,
yeah, yeah.
um,
Life, the universe, and everything. Um, but yeah, it strikes me that, like, you know, in his categories of existence, category 8 contrasts, that he does allow for contrasts. He says the eighth category, contrast, includes an indefinite progression of categories as we can proceed from contrasts to contrast of contrasts and so on indefinitely. And so it's like right in there in the categories of existence is a category that affords for the possibility of indefinitely many more categories to emerge, right, in the course of um, the history of the universe, in the course of philosophizing, in the context of an unfolding universe. Um,
hmm.
right. So it's like I think he wants to capture what you're worried about using this category of contrasts, instead of having to say that new eternal objects can be created, right? Because it's
Yeah,
like we can try to patch some of the holes that eternal objects seem to open up, but it's like as soon as you do that, you create leaks somewhere else in the scheme. So that's what I found in trying to tinker with Whitehead's scheme. It's like you might resolve some confusion or solve some other problem that he hadn't figured out by moving things around a little bit, but then you create, you know, a dozen new problems by doing that. So
that is true. Well, what do you make, if we look at it from a different angle a little bit, what do you make of bringing the ontological principle, which I know you addressed too in your a couple points in your recent paper?
mhm.
So, and where are you on when it comes to like how, when you talk about cosmogenesis and stuff, where are you on sort of ultimate origins on this? Like, are you accepting that there's a pluralistic metaphysics, that there's God plus, that there always must be God and something else in terms of some other actual entities? Or does that
Mm.
make no sense to you?
I think God plus, I mean, for God to be conscious, there needs to be other actual occasions for God to um, feel physically.
Mhm.
Uh, but like, I mean, are
So you're accepting there's some level of, in terms of that's necessary, that there's some pluralistic type
mm,
relation going on always. It's that we're talking about a system rather than some monistic thing. We're talking about
mm,
some
right? Yeah, I mean, I
things
do.
working as a complex adaptive system or something like this. I don't know how to describe it, but
Well, yeah,
so
what really does draw me to Whitehead's metaphysics is that plurality. I mean, he says early on that, you know, his philosophy of organism is a pluralistic ontology in opposition to Spinoza's monism, and that's like ontological pluralism is a bit of a mind fuck. Forgive the French, but it's it's hard to imagine multiple actual worlds like arising and perishing moment by moment. Um, but that's what Whitehead's presenting to us. that the universe is constantly recreating itself. The many become one or increase by one, and so on. And I think it's not that he's rejecting the like a holistic picture um, of the cosmos. I mean, everything's internally related to everything else, at least in the past, and so it's deeply relational, but no whole is final, right? It's an open-ended process, and new wholes are constantly emerging with each uh, pulse of experience, and that that to me, yeah, that seems like the right balance between um, monism and um, pluralism without resulting in some like fragmentary picture, or also without resulting in Leibniz's kind of windowless monads, where
Mhm.
you do have this pluralism, but every experiencer is in its own virtual reality and not actually in contact with anything else. It's like
Yeah,
giving God way too much power.
that I agree. That doesn't do much for me. But so are you thinking more in line with some analogy to like a sort of like a body cell type, type analogy that's always used, where like a world soul concept with God? I don't know um,
Mm-hmm.
exactly how best to describe it, but like a panentheistic scenario where we're akin to the cells type of thing.
I like
And
that image. Yeah. I mean, Whitehead says it's a cell theory of actuality. And as long as we remember that this is a growing embryo and not just a adult organism that's already fully
mhm.
formed, um, so that there's no, he says that the universe is incomplete in some sense, right? So as long as this cosmic body is still in the process of, it's in embryogenesis still, right? It's not yet the adult form that would be finished, and it doesn't seem like the analogy doesn't go that far, right? With a multicellular organism where you reach adulthood and then just start to kind of
Mhm.
decay when you're done growing. It's just growing forever. So,
Yeah, I
mhm.
agree on that. So, I mean, I guess to go back to the ontological principle piece, like if it's no actuality, no reason situation, but we have multiple actualities or something, like why must, quote, the eternal object somehow, you know, why can't something like the function of an eternal object be in some simple actualities and passed along, if there's always has been or something? Does that make any sense? Like, why does it all have to be in one place, so to speak, like in the primordial nature? Why can't somehow it be distributed elsewhere? That was kind of what I was trying to play with in the paper. I guess one part of it was just like, why can't we think of some really abstract stuff like randomness or something like that? I don't know, being inside subatomic particles or whatever, and those are always passed along, and something weird like that. It's not the normal way of obviously getting into this discussion, but I just feel like you could maybe refocus, like I put in the paper, refocus the ontological principle so it's not just only focused on sort of the primordial nature of God and all that piece.
Yeah, I've always imagined the primordial nature as not like someplace else up there, but
Mhm.
actually, like, if you were to ask, well, where is the primordial nature of God? Well, it is radically distributed in every occasion of experience as the initial aim, or the initial eros. So it's not anywhere else but in the experience of actual occasions. It's just that it's the non-temporal um, aspect of all of these finite occasions. And so I think the language of God misleads us into imagining some separate being out there that would be the reservoir of possibility, when I think Whitehead's intention, despite that language, is to have that um, that reservoir of possibility radically distributed throughout the experience of every actual occasion, right? So God is nowhere but within every moment of experience, as as like the initial character given to creativity. And I mean, at the end of the day, Whitehead's saying that God is a contingent um, accident of creativity. And so random, if I don't know that we would want to necessarily equate randomness and creativity, but there's something like a primordial chaos out of which even God arises, but as the first um, entity to arise out of that primordial chaos, that then sets like the that's like the bass note that all the rest of the universe will be riffing on for time immemorial. Um, so it's like God is unique in the sense of being first in line, but
But why would this primordial chaos cease to exist after that point? After this,
well, it doesn't. That's why there's evil, right? I mean, that's why creativity can diverge from what the initial character given to it by God. So it is still present. I mean, there's, I think even like Whitehead refers to creativity, maybe it's in Adventures of Ideas as like this anarchist principle that's like still there, uh, but that the initial aim from God gives us some opportunity to discover relevant novelty amidst that chaos, but it's still like God doesn't vanquish chaos. I think it's still
exactly. So,
there.
but why would it necessarily be deemed evil if it can? You know what I mean? That sounds like kind of
Well,
like
evil is such a charged theological word, but
as I said, it sounds a little, yeah, Christian remnant to me to say that it's, you know,
yeah, I mean,
the word
evil and
chaos gets associated so often with things like the feminine
yeah,
or other things society, and so and then it can get and then it gets kind of like demonized historically speaking when it seems like it's both necessary and it doesn't strike me as why it has to be viewed as evil or the agent of evil or something.
yeah, yeah. I mean, like I said, evil is such a charged word, and but in Whitehead's way of rendering it, it's just like creativity in the wrong season or something. Like creativity and that disrupts the settled habits of its habitat, and that's both potentially going to degrade the order that's been achieved in that habitat or in that social context, but also it's the catalyst for further novelty and complexification because of how that how the society in which this disruption arises responds, right? And so evil is takes on more the quality of like a trickster, I think, in Whitehead's way of thinking about it, just stirring the pot, mixing things up. And human beings, in the context of our societies and different cultures and historical periods, have moralized about this. But it's pretty clear that in human history, what initially new moral impulses that are initially rejected by the society at large actually end up being the seeds for what hundreds of years later we're like, wow, I'm glad that caught on.
Yeah. So
So
let
yeah,
me so bringing some of the stuff that we talked about already together, and it's like how then, especially if we're talking about like propositions versus eternal objects, or making that distinction, how how exactly is it that if we're talking about propositions, I guess, that we, like you or I or something, is actually capable of generating a novel one?
hmm.
Like, what is how is dynamics of this actually play out within, like, let's say part three or something of processor? Like, where how would you see that occurring? Because I got the impression that it was more like when you're looking at part three that okay, you can you can kind of go back to a bunch of different options that God nevertheless kind of already has there. Um, the initial aim can be shifted or whatever else, but it's like it's you're still referring back to something ordered by God already.
Right. I think it's as long as we remember that we're talking about an infinite realm of eternal objects, I'm less concerned about, you know, limitations on our freedom because God has already envisaged all the possibilities. It's like God has already envisaged an infinity of possibilities. And so and what that provides, so if we got rid of that envisagement, and just had like possibility unordered by any primordial divine envisagement, it would be hard for me to understand how we could explore with our imaginative freedom, um, how we could explore the connections between eternal objects. Like, how would we know which eternal objects were proximate to which other eternal objects? Because there's a lack of the relevance function that the divine would provide. And so, like, yeah, exploring the space of pure
That I
possibility.
get, but you still don't need all of them, do you? You could still approximate. I mean, why does it nevertheless still need to be infinite? Because you could still have an incomplete, let's say, thing, and nevertheless still have a ton, and do a lot of the things that you're talking about. Or is that, or you don't think so?
Well, I mean, if there are only a limited number of possibilities to draw upon, then that severely curtails the advance into novelty for the universe. Like, eventually, depending on how long the universe lasts, we're going to run out of new things to try. And so, I would very much prefer to have that infinite set of eternal objects to draw on, so that that novelty never
Oh,
uh,
so you don't think it
runs out.
could? You don't think there's a process there that could grow it infinitely? So like here, so I'm thinking more in terms of like there is this incomplete, but never it will be constantly growing.
Yeah, the actual
We
world will
wouldn't,
be
so that
constantly
we wouldn't run out, right? Like you're saying, right? The
right.
concern of running out. Because on your, to flip it to what you're saying, to me, what's always been confusing is like I get the advantages of talking about the infinite, you know, this complete envisagement or whatever, but then I lose sight as to the purpose, I guess, of the process of reality completely. Like I don't really understand what's gained. Not that I guess anything has to be gained, but it just seems
Hmm.
weird.
Well, I mean, with just infinite, the envisagement of the infinite realm of eternal objects, I mean, there's a deficiency in that they're not actualized, they haven't been realized, and they haven't the 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 realization of some finite selection of eternal objects in the experience of an actual occasion is what gives them those possibilities value. There's no
It doesn't alter them
it doesn't
in any way.
alter their status as definite possibilities, but it does. I mean, like that quote I read when we started, it enriches God's experience, let's say. Um, to
Which
have
suggests a lot. I mean, that word enrichment inherently suggests some type of deficiency. I understand that from
Yeah,
where it's quote deficient, it says as much, right? Many
yeah.
places. Then again, what does that really mean? You know, like it's it, that's where it all kind of seems to still not connect fully for me.
Well, it's like the difference between the idea of a delicious piece of cheesecake and actually enjoying the cheesecake. I mean, sometimes the idea is better because you get the cheesecake and you eat it and you feel like crap afterwards. But maybe better. The difference between, um, yeah, the ideal and the reality is like when you get the real thing. There's the depth of the the beauty of um, the passing moment, like the way in which Whitehead likes to distinguish between the dream of youth and the harvest of tragedy, and thinks that it's the tragic beauty that is the most intense form of beauty because of the way in which it passes, the way in which it perishes. And so it's almost like, I mean, one way of thinking of it would be to put yourself in the position of an angel. Imagine you're an angel. You don't die. You don't have a body, and you look at human beings experiencing death and like still loving each other despite the fact that like the body decays and dies, and like none of us know, human beings
Mhm.
don't know what happens across that threshold of death. And like as an angel, you're like, oh my god, what is that like? um I think, yeah, I mean, these are just analogies to try to get at this, but it seems like there's something about physically realized experience that just takes the eternal idea beyond its isolation in abstraction. And um,
But if the material piece, whatever that even means exactly, if
mhm,
it doesn't have, like, I struggle to see how there's not chaos. I mean, we can look at it in his terms too. He talks about non, non-social nexuses or something, right? Speak
yeah,
to the notion of chaos or something like that. And negative prehensions. Normally people just, they bring up negative prehensions and they act as if it's just written off. It's like, well, it's no longer relevant, you know, like but yet he makes it clear it's not like it just disappears or something into thin air.
right. Yeah, I mean, yeah, every actual occasion of experience is feeling the infinite realm of eternal objects, but most of that is under negation as not relevant to the given situation. But we need like the contrast between which eternal objects are ingressed um, as and become fully determinate, and the vast network of other eternal objects that are not ingressed as physically relevant is super important, because like um, I mean, that's how we form propositions, first of all, by drawing on proximate possibilities that weren't realized in the last moment of experience. But also, um, there's so many examples of how what doesn't happen to you is actually really important for how you feel about it. So, the example I use with my students all the time is like when you're in a busy city and you're about to go into the crosswalk to cross the street, and you don't look both ways, and a car honks at you just as you take your first step, and you step back and barely get missed by the car. So what you experience in that moment is a rush of adrenaline, anxiety, relief that you did not get hit by the car. So the fact that you can have all that experience of something that didn't actually, like, what didn't happen to you is what's most relevant for the experience you're having in that moment.
Yeah, for
Right.
sure. In that case, you're right.
And you could think of other examples like this where what the possibilities that did not manifest are nonetheless part of your experience, right? And I feel like that's what negative prehension is trying to get at, because Whitehead would say we're not. It's not like it isn't felt; it's just felt under negation.
Yeah, that's true. I agree with what you're saying. It's just the reason why I think only we I don't want to, and that's just my own personal problem. It's like I don't want to. I'm willing to accept um the everything you're saying, and I like maybe looking at maybe a distinction between propositions and internal objects and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
But I something it's more of a feeling level than anything else. Like it just doesn't feel something feels off to me when we start talking in terms of the infinite, and I don't see how part 5 makes good sense. I don't feel like we have much of a role, and maybe we don't.
You like human freedom, you mean? And
Yeah, basically, uh,
mm.
or any other creaturely freedom that we're aware of.
So tell me more about what you're proposing in this article in terms of how to, because is your goal to restore that feeling of human freedom and that we're playing a creative role here too, and not just drawing on God's pre-existing set of options?
Basically, yeah. I mean, because I also think that, like others have said before me, right, that it's strange to think in terms of even omnibenevolence and other things. Like it all kind of gets mixed in, where it's odd, right? That like
Mhm.
I feel like I can't particularly add something, and that's part of what a love relationship, right, truly is, the ability to even be able to provide something real, something novel,
Mhm.
your beloved, and like it feels very sort of one directional, or at least too much for
Mm.
me. Yeah, so I'd like to uh, at least try and find a way while still maintaining within Whitehead's general system to try to, because like you said, you start tweaking one thing and then everything else falls apart, right? You pull the string in one place and it's all cinched up
Right.
into a mess, or no, not. So, um, where to pull or where to add,
Right.
or maybe not at all. I mean, it seems like you're pretty content with where it stands, or maybe you're just playing,
Well,
well, defending him right now. I'm not sure.
there's some. So the paper that was just published in Process Studies is the shorter version. There's a much longer version that'll be in a book, hopefully early in 2024, where I go into the issue with the subjective species of eternal objects and the way in which I'm unhappy with Whitehead's treatment. So I use the example of color experience.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and in Process and Reality, when Whitehead introduces this concept of sensa, like simple eternal objects that cannot be further analyzed, and color seems like the obvious example to go to. I use the study of color that Johann Wolfgang von Goethe developed in opposition to Isaac Newton's understanding of color as kind of reducible to um, the geometric study of refraction and whatnot. And Goethe's like, we don't need to bring in mathematics to study color because color is a qualitative phenomenological thing. And Goethe kind of shows how the colors of the spectrum emerge as a result of contrast with one another. Um, and I think this is the direction Hartshorne goes, though I admit I haven't actually studied Hartshorne's work very closely. But it seems like, and I think you go into this in your paper, that Hartshorne was happy with objective eternal objects, but not so much with subjective eternal objects.
Mm-hmm.
He saw the subjective species more as emerging in the course of time and evolution, I guess, right?
That's been my understanding, yeah. But
Because where Whitehead leaves us is having to find some way of coordinating between the objective species, which in the case of color would be like wavelengths of light, and then the qualitative experience of the color itself. And the problem is, um, we've just, it's known experimentally that there's almost never a one-to-one correlation between the wavelength of light and how we experience color, how we experience the color of that light, because color is shaped by context. And there's a whole physiological aspect to it. And so it's just way more complicated. And Whitehead, in this part of Process and Reality, talks about how in the course, there's a lot of hand waving going on, which is uncharacteristic for him. But like in the course of the history of the universe, the objective species or wavelengths of light and the subjective species, various colors, are shepherded so as to properly correspond with one another. And I'm just unhappy with that for a variety of reasons. One, because I don't think all colors are simple sensa. I think like um, blue and yellow make green, right? So that means green is not simple. It's a contrast between blue and yellow, right? Um, and so yeah, there's a lot that I still want to work through there, and the challenge is just seeing how I might want to take the bold step of amending Whitehead's scheme without causing new problems, you know. Um, because I understand his reason for differentiating between the objective and the subjective species, uh, because like we can't negatively prehend objective eternal objects because that constitutes the uniformity of space-time, right? Whereas we can negatively prehend the subjective species, which is part of what allows us to reinterpret what happens in the physical, what we receive in the physical pole. Um,
Yeah, that's
so
all relevant to part 4 as
mhm,
well. If
mhm,
we get into that
yeah,
with Andrew, because yeah,
right.
like, and it doesn't get any easier
It,
there. So,
it
but
doesn't.
you're right. Like that's critical when we get to extension or whatever, right?
Mhm.
Part 4. Um,
So, I mean, I do in this article defend the idea of eternal objects, but because I don't think the alternatives I've seen are either aren't coherent or aren't giving me everything that I would want in a cosmology or a metaphysical scheme. Um, but I'm not finally happy with all the details of Whitehead's approach either. It's just I'm not quite sure how to improve it yet. I just have noticed this issue with regard to the subjective species of eternal objects. Yeah. So I need to read more Hartshorne, it sounds like, and figure out what he was upset about there.
yeah, that might be helpful just because it's a huge point of contention
Mm-hmm.
between the two of them. Maybe the biggest in many ways,
Yeah.
is from what it seems. But let's go into this a little more on that. So, because this is interesting, I like to hear where you think there's improvement or
Mm-hmm.
could be improvement.
Yeah.
Uh, but it's hard. You're right. I mean, so do you have any sort of inclinations at the moment as to how you think you might try and resolve that, or you just more feel the problem or tension?
Well, I mean, it could be that some of what Whitehead grouped into the subjective species of eternal objects are actually contrasts, which new contrasts do emerge in the course of the history of the universe. Um, so, thinking through though what that changes in his account of his genetic analysis of concrescence and the understanding of prehension is something that might take some years, but at least there's work to do. But yeah, I think that's the direction I think I would have to go in. That like colors, sounds, emotions, and stuff. We're actually talking about contrasts um, rather than eternal objects, which would leave us with. I mean, it could be that there are some subjective eternal objects, but I don't know how to distinguish which would be contrasts and which would be eternal objects, um, because it is kind of hard to think through how the mathematical species or the objective eternal objects could ever give rise through contrast to something qualitative, um,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so it's almost like there's a subtler bifurcation of nature still, like the residue of that still in the deepest sort of deep in the mechanics of Whitehead's metaphysics. There's still this residue of bifurcation, right, between the objective and subjective species, and I would really like to resolve that.
I like your shifting to let's look at contrast, let's look at propositions,
Mhm.
and go against just looking at eternal objects, and that's probably a good move to make. Now, once we start doing that, then it's still though, like we said, going to then bear back upon I'm sure the eternal objects again, like once we try to shift around to a different part of the system, I I feel like if we do a bunch of work talking about contrast and propositions, I don't really think it's going to leave everything else unscathed.
Mm-hmm.
Um, or do you think that it will? That those can just be talked about like that separately?
I mean, everything's so intimately connected in Whitehead's categorical scheme that it's hard to think it won't have knock-on effects.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
But it's important that it doesn't in many ways, right? Because if we're still holding to this notion of especially infinite,
right.
I feel like whatever we end up saying now about contrast and propositions better not have too much of a blowback, I
Mhm.
guess, onto, right?
What's interesting is that, on this particular question of the nature of color, in Goethe's study of color, he goes back to Plato, Plato's Timaeus,
Mm-hmm.
where Plato actually warns. He says it would be unwise for any mere mortal to seek to give an account of the proportions among the colors and to understand how color can arise out of contrasts. And Plato actually says it is God who possesses both the knowledge and power required to mix a plurality into a unity, and conversely to dissolve a unity into a plurality, while no human being could possess either of these. Um, and so, you've got giants, intellectual giants like Plato and Goethe both saying like, this might be beyond our capacity as human beings to actually understand. And so I'm definitely
Well,
humbled by this warning, but it seems like
to be fair, everything's a warning to me. He's got he's got stuff against the receptacle that you and I have talked about.
right.
Well, and really it's a demiurge, so it's a god, but it's not an
Yeah.
omnipotent god.
I mean, it could just be in the context of like a cosmological scheme, the best we can do is a likely story, and we'll never be able to work out all the details. Um, but I have reached the point in my study of Whitehead where I can no longer just defend everything he says, because there are these points where something feels off, like you were saying, is right. It starts as a feeling,
Mhm.
and then to work out the logic of it though is a daunting task, because of we're dealing with one of the 20th century's most gifted logicians, right? So for me to think I'm gonna tinker here and there and improve it is like probably a long shot. So for
But that
now,
could be the advantage is not thinking as a logician, right? I mean,
right?
coming at it from some totally different angle is probably what's going to be needed.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, because you're right. I'm sure he had that part pretty well, thought out.
But I do think color is this window into
So
man.
why did God need green, so to speak? Like why was it necessary that God already is aware of green 13 something billion, let's say, but after, like I said, after creation started, but shortly after,
Right.
why is that needed? The qualitative, let's not just talk wavelength difference, but like what you're talking with Goethe and all this.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Well, it seems like there's probably, I mean, in Whitehead's scheme, there'd be something it feels like to be um, like a photon or a electromagnetic pulse, right? That vibratory frequency has some aesthetic um, feeling associated with it, or achieved by it, and so even before there are eyes, um, there is something it's like to be the physical vibration, which would eventually be correlated with the visual experience of color once the eyes do arise, right?
and as your point though, those aren't the same thing.
But they're not the same thing, right?
So
Um,
how is that? That's what I'm saying. It seems like
you do need light. You need light to experience color,
Uh-huh.
Goethe's point is you also need darkness, that color actually emerges at the because of the interaction between light and darkness, or light and some medium, of some material medium, um, which is part of his polemic against Newton. But until you have eyes, there is no color in the universe. And so then the question becomes, well, was color already among the possibilities envisaged by God? Or yeah, or is it a contrast that emerges in the course of the history of the universe as a result of these evolutionary processes that
If,
produce?
and if it is, Matt's not the best example, but it shows that it's a universal, at least, that therefore what you can call it a contrast, but it's born of a contrast or whatever, but it's a universal.
Mhm.
Is green not? Greenness not?
It's kind of vexing though, right? Because with color experience, like, can I know what your experience of green is like? I mean, we have the word,
Sure, I get that. That's
um, but I don't know if your green is my green.
true.
And
But
so the name,
at least conceptually, you can understand that, like, whatever you see as think or experience as greenness, and I do, we both would agree that it can be in multiple things, of course.
right?
It's
Yeah,
not that it's only in one. I'm sure we both agree that it's not in one particular or something only.
right. And we know, like, we both agree that trees are green. We both agree that the sky is blue, right? So we can coordinate using these words, our shared experience of one world, and the way that these colors partake in.
And the fact that let's say it is a universal, but how I experience it, like you said, might be very different than you.
Mhm,
All of that only speaks to further quote to your original quote, enrichment
mhm,
of whatever this consequent nature of God at the very beginning of our outset. Like, whereas again, I'm not sure what it otherwise would mean to say that, well, God had green or God knew green or whatever. Greenness has always been type of thing.
yeah, I mean, I think where I think we both share this intuition and desire is like that we want to inhabit a universe wherein, like, God can be surprised.
But yes, basically. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, again, to the heart surgeons, he brings this stuff up a lot about how it's not just it's an issue that is now going to cut into omnibenevolence and other things, as he puts it,
Mhm.
because of the fact that in a normal human love relationship, right, there's this reciprocal exchange that is effectively we're being robbed of the possibility of providing the same level of right and flow of novelty or something backwards to God, and it's too one dimensional or whatever, um,
Mhm.
the flow of it. And then he basically starts to, like, I think, pick at it and start to unpack it, and it shows that how it goes, it bleeds out, like we keep talking today about, like, you mess with one thing, right,
Mhm.
it's going to start impacting all the other elements.
Right. Yeah, I mean, one of the dangers of working out a metaphysical scheme in such technical detail is that if one little part of it proves to be inadequate, then the whole thing has to be trashed in a way, because, like, it's this elaborate um, construction where, if you have to change something about actual occasions and eternal objects, that's like, those are base categories, and anything
Yeah.
on top is going to collapse. Um, but, like, maybe it's not quite that severe of a situation, because even in Process and Reality, Whitehead does abolish a category, right, on page 250.
Well, that's
Um,
true. With the trans,
he abolishes conceptual reversion,
yeah.
because he thinks just the initial aim, from the primordial nature, can do the work of that category. So it's like superfluous. So that does less damage to the rest of the structure of categories if it's just superfluous. But if you have to amend a definition here or there, like yeah, that does have ramifications. Um,
I don't think we need to dump. That's why I've never wanted to dump it completely, because I mean, in case it's not pretty obvious, like classical theism in any form does very little for me. It never really has. I've never been much attracted to it.
Sorry, which you're not much attracted to what? I missed the first part.
To any form of like classical forms of theism,
Oh, sure. Yeah, likewise.
and
Hmm.
just it's nice to keep omnibenevolence, sure, I guess, but the other ones, I'm not. It doesn't affect me to have to like tinker with those, but
Hmm.
so process has always been attractive for that reason to me. But like you said, once you stick with it for a while, it's hard to just like uphold Whitehead, let's say, alone without finding some issue.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, there's the further problem, which I'm sure you've addressed in other places. We haven't talked about it though. I, I've always taken issue. I don't know where you stand on this whole notion of the eternal concrescence piece.
Mm. Oh, versus God as a society.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
problem.
Um, yeah. I so in my book I in Crossing the Threshold I explore the possibility of um, a like God as a kind of world soul for each cosmic epoch, and that as one epoch um, comes to an end, that universe dies in a sense, but that there might be something that is objectively immortal in it that would be inherited by
Mm.
the world soul of the next cosmic epoch. And so it's in a way it's like God as a reincarnating um, string of world souls, and so the primordial nature then isn't eternal anymore. Um,
That puts you and I in closer alignment to some of the other stuff we talked about last time. What I was the totally crazy nonsense that I was going just messing with last time we talked and at the conference, but
right.
that does sound in closer alignment with that.
Yeah. So, but I'm like trying to have it both ways in a way that like there's something preserved between cosmic epochs that is inherited by the the divine um, entity from one incarnation to the next or one cosmic epoch to the next, but that much is also lost. And I explore this possibility in the context of a chapter that's basically bringing Nietzsche into conversation with Whitehead and really trying to challenge any residual Platonism and um, reference to a realm of ideal forms and so on. And I
How is
think,
Nietzsche brought it, like in contrast to an eternal recurrence of the same or something? You're trying to go against that notion?
well, yeah, I want to go against that, but also using just Nietzsche's hammer to attack any elements in Whitehead that might still be conceived as overly Apollonian or something, overly Platonic,
Okay.
such as the primordial nature of God. Like I don't think Nietzsche obviously has no patience for any such concept, and so I tried to amend Whitehead. I don't fully jump on board with everything Nietzsche says, but I try to test Whitehead's theology by bringing him into dialogue with Nietzsche, and yeah, end up with this idea of God as a kind of reincarnating world soul that arises and perishes with each cosmic epoch, like with each dominant regime of order that characterizes a cosmos, and that there might be some string of inheritance that connects these two, but I leave that as an open question. Um,
You
and
could get to that too, something kind of like it. If well, so okay, from what you're saying though, is this on this understanding, then God's inherently not infinite or is like limited in some sense each and within each epoch?
Yeah, so God wouldn't just be one eternally concressing entity,
Okay.
but
So
more like a society. Yeah.
yeah, what I was kind of trying to get at before when we were at like the conference and stuff was just like I can't I get so frustrated in the religion and science debate about how it's always some radical on one side or the other, where it's like some new atheist versus some almost like intelligent design type person or whatever, right? And you can't get into a far more interesting discussion like we're having right now of alternative options. And I was trying to even pose a way of like, here's how, as wild as it might be in terms of how unlikely, you
Mm-hmm.
could maybe get it something God like, obviously not the God of classical theism at all, but like God like
Yeah.
through a physicalist framework, which I'm not saying I even adhere to that, but just I'll grant physicalism, everything, run the tape forward, so to speak, right?
Mm-hmm.
Vastly into the future of a previous, incarnation, say, of a universe.
Right.
You can effectively like trying to play that Boltzmann brain stuff right against them, that concept that's kind of an embarrassment in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
I think playing it against, but we don't need to go into that, but just trying to show that like what you're doing, you could even if maybe try to say like could have even emerged strictly from physicalist framework, although it's taking it on much more of a stretch. But
Well, I mean, I would go back to Whitehead's history, his treatment of the history of science in Science in the Modern World, where he just points out how much the medieval theology influenced the birth of modern science. Just the very idea that there would be a rational explanation. I mean, the idea of like a principle of sufficient reason, and the idea that mathematics could explain nature and that nature has this causal structure that is so precisely ordered so as to be amenable to that kind of mathematical analysis, that for the early scientists that was like as much proof of God as you could ever ask for. And so the whole
yeah,
idea of physicalism is soaked in theology and a particular form of theology. And in some ways, science, modern science, is an anti-rationalist reaction against the scholasticism of the medieval period, but it's also carrying forward a lot of that rationalism.
I
And
agree with
so
that.
there are a lot of contemporary like scientists, physicists, chemists, not as many biologists, but there are still some who are deeply Christian
Mm-hmm.
and also from what I can tell, doing very good science. And they're basically almost materialistic in their mechanistic in their approach to science. But they have this kind of deist basically understanding that wow, this mechanism is so precisely engineered. There's no way that this could have just sort of naturally evolved through some random process. It's like, and so what's going on there? And like with atheists who think you can have laws of physics and like not be not feel any kind of responsibility to explain where these laws come from, it's kind of odd to me, right? And so it's such a silly debate to have these two extremes of the creationist on the one side and the atheist on the other side, because in some ways at the level that it really matters, like metaphysically speaking, they're they're coming from the same place and they're just disagreeing at this very superficial level. um, I mean, I don't want to accuse atheists of just being hubristic, but in some sense what seems to be happening psychologically is like they're putting at least the ideal, if not themselves, at least like the ideal scientific intellect in the place of God, whereas the religious scientist is treating science as a form of worship of the divine's intelligence. Um, seems to be the only difference between the two, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's just it's sad that ever since at least I remember Doc the God Delusion, where the difference between the hardcover and the paperback, where he like added some response to initial criticism,
Yeah.
the paperback. And I remember his answer was like, uh, someone said, you only attack the worst, in theology and religion, whatever. And you don't go into more nuanced systems, kind of the stuff we're talking about or whatever.
Yeah.
And his answer just, well, it's statistically negligible, so I don't have to. So it's like, all right, well, that's
Sure. Go after the low hanging fruit. That's sell your books.
to jump back to really quick where you said we were talking about a reincarnating God within these different epochs, but within the epoch, not from one to go within it.
Mm-hmm.
It's in a constant state of like, is it a serially ordered society or of occasions of experience or not?
I would say no. So like yeah, within each epoch, the world soul or the divine entity is one concrescence. Um, and that like the complete life history of that universe is equivalent to the the cresting and crashing of that wave of concrescence, right? Because there does need to be, it seems like every cosmic epoch has like some fine-tuned set of fundamental constants and um, basic laws out of which then the evolution of further complexity can arise. And so, yeah, I still do conceive of each world soul as one actual entity.
So how do you account for the superjective or whatever is nature that allows for initial aims? That's always, I think, been the concern, right?
Mm-hmm.
With the distinction between the eternal concrescence versus serially ordered society
Yeah.
was like you run into all these, you know, problems again with the way Whitehead at least explains how it's supposed to operate. You know what I'm
Well,
saying?
yeah.
Because how can you provide the right? Like if you're still in concrescence, then you're not capable of
Mm-hmm.
allowing that influence to allow the initial. It's a that was why they made the shift anyhow. Like the people I thought
Right.
Son Griffin and
Right.
Cobb, he moved away from it. I think I don't remember Cobb, but Griffin stuck with it. I think
Yeah. I mean, it could be that that God's satisfaction in a given cosmic epoch would only be experienced through the multiple satisfactions of the whole cosmic community of actual occasions, of finite actual occasions.
that puts us in the role quite literally as gods then. Because then, like you said, because then we are the ones having to provide somehow all the different actual entities are somehow providing the initial aims for the others. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I think the primordial nature could still provide the relevant novelty, and then in terms of like God's love for the world, or I mean, sometimes it's what had in part five. There's like the three phases, and then there's the fourth creative phase he adds, like in the last few pages, which uh, is that the same as the third? Why is there four now? But yeah, the superjective nature of God, um, I think, is in some large part it depends on our participation and our conscious affirmation of that as a reality. And I kind of like that idea that like the consequent nature of God really does depend on our willingness as creatures to um, participate in it, and in participating in it realize it. Like it doesn't happen unless we do that.
So do we need to speak then, if that's the case, as like there's the primordial nature, there's the consequent nature, and there's God as a whole, whatever that is, like a third way of understanding it?
Hmm.
Or is that an unnecessary? You know what I
Well,
mean? It feels like
yeah,
there needs to be somehow then
it's
like
supposed
a
to be one God, not two gods.
yeah.
Um,
So I don't know, does that bring the receptacle piece in somehow or whatever in some weird way, or not?
Yeah, well, like in Plato, the receptacle is sort of like, I mean, it's a dark and difficult idea, as he says, but it is something like the form of formlessness,
Hmm.
and thereby providing like the medium into which all other forms can be physically realized. But I think in Whitehead, the receptacle, in becoming more like a consequent nature of God, is not a form of formlessness or anything else. It's more like memory.
That's how I'm understanding. Because, like, you're right. For Plato, it's clear that there's being, there's becoming, and there's that in which things become.
Right.
It's what the triton gene, whatever the third, this
Same thing. Yeah.
substance, whatever. But for Whitehead, or maybe not for Whiting, for you and
Hmm.
I feel like somehow that talking in terms of memory or whatever, information and memory and retaining it
Hmm.
holographically or something, I don't know, is a better way of discussing it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's cosmic memory. It's what, I mean, this is when Whitehead said God saves the world. God does not create the world, even though he later says God creates the world as much as the world creates God. But he does say God doesn't create the world, God saves the world,
Mm-hmm.
which is, the that aspect of the divine which is preserving the objective immortality uh, of every actual occasion which has ever arisen and perished, and that without that memory, then there could be no real sense of the achievement of value, because like compared to what, like
Mm-hmm.
every moment is totally new and there's no context for it.
And for you or for you and I, the next question also becomes if there's a reincarnating type concept of
Mhm.
God, how much is lost?
Yeah.
All, a lot, and, and is that
Yeah.
problematic?
I I think I like the idea that there's much at risk, like that God risks something in creating. Um, and so this idea of a reincarnating God, I mean, it's a God that is born, lives, and dies at a much different sort of scale than any finite organism or actual occasion. Um, but still, it's a picture of God that is not protected from death. And just in the way that we as human beings, human persons, confront that threshold with a lot of uncertainty, I think that's true also for God in this picture. And that this, for me, it helps actually to relate to God as a companion, a fellow sufferer. If God doesn't die, then God does not understand what our experience is like.
I agree with you on that. That also speaks back to like how we understand love and everything else that I find problematic with what I'm doing.
Yeah.
One way to deal with what you're talking about, I would think, is that you've got back to that demiurge concept. You could understand this like dying, reincarnating God as yet a higher being or something, but quote, not the old,
Mm.
not the
Sure.
ultimate, so to speak, or lodge it into something larger again.
Mm-hmm.
Um, seems
Yeah, I have a
about
lot of time for that. Like what is the ultimate Godhead? Like, don't kid yourselves. Let's just focus on, somewhere lower down the hierarchy of spiritual beings and just try to understand, uh, like what's in our local metaphysical neighborhood, so to speak.
Mhm.
Um,
I
so
like it though. I think it's an important thing, regardless, to talk about whether that is the highest or that is God, something that's dying, reincarnating, or just viewing it as like it's a much higher quote level than we are at. It's
mhm.
still something that ought to be discussed. It's there's way too much discussion of whether or not there is a God or there isn't, and in these extremes, rather than
Yeah, no, the interesting question is what kind of God,
yeah,
I
maybe
think.
there was and there's not now, or there will be, and it's just
Right.
all language games to an extent. But um, all this is very interesting. We'll have to get Andrew Andrew's take on
Mhm.
this. I don't know where he stands at all on
Poor
any of
guy's gonna have to watch this first before. No, maybe he doesn't need to do that, but
to jump
yeah.
into it. I mean, yeah,
Um,
this has been fun. I always like talking about this stuff.
yeah,
Especially with
no,
someone younger.
I appreciate your interest in sparking this conversation, and yeah, let's do more. We'll rope Andrew in the new year here, and then yeah, just keep it going, see where we end up.
Yeah, I'm still happy to do if we wanted to stick with what we were talking about doing part 3, 4, and 5. I mean, it seems like
Mhm.
this was actually good to have this conversation because it lets you and I at least know a little bit more about each other and where we kind of stand, and we can go and see where Andrew like again what his take is.
Yeah, and I look forward to spending more time with your article. It's pretty cool that that'll be in the next issue of Process Studies, you said.
For all I know, you were the reviewer. One of the two reviewers. I don't know, but
I probably, well, your name wouldn't have been on it, but no, it wasn't me. uh,
yeah. Well, I appreciate that at least in that journal they're willing to take chances on stuff
oh
more.
yeah,
So it's
yeah.
good. You need to.
Cool. Well, I got to run, Darren, but if you're cool with it, I'll throw this up on my channel for anyone who's interested enough to get into the weeds with us.
Yeah, that sounds good. And we should probably tell, yeah, Andrew to look at it
Yeah,
because
I'll share it with him.
it might be a surprise otherwise. Some of the things coming up.
Right. Cool.
Cool.
Well, I hope you enjoy the holidays, and I'll be in touch in the new year. And I mean, if Andrew doesn't follow up, then yeah, either you or I will, and we'll find a date to do
Yeah.
another session.
Hopefully early. I mean, since we're all on break, I assume
Hmm.
you are right until
Yep,
middle of January, end of January.
mid-January.
Yeah. So it'd be great if we could knock out like one or two before then, just because it's always easiest.
Yeah, and it'll be fresh.
Yeah. All right. Cool.
All right,
Then I'll
Darren.
send an
Good to
email.
talk to you.
All right. Have a
Take
good
care.
afternoon.
You too.
Bye.